A broken federal government reminds us there's hope in state legislatures. A recent column at CarolinaJournal.com carries that headline. Its author is Ray Nothstine, opinion editor at Carolina Journal, and you put these two types of government in contrast. The federal government, which has all kinds of problems, compared to state governments, especially here in North Carolina, where things look a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big points of the piece was really just to kind of show how state governments are responding to crises that we face today. And you don't really see that a lot in the federal government. And you have a debt crisis, obviously over $28 trillion in debt, and there seems to be no end in sight. In fact, the proposals that come out of Washington are just to double down on increased spending more and more, make it, I think, now it's over 30-something% of GDP per year, and it's going to extend, at least in the Biden years, probably at least over a quarter of GDP government spending. So that's been a great contrast here in North Carolina, where you've had the slowing the rate of growth of state government, even with a new influx of residents kind of pouring in to the state. So there's all kinds of contrasts. That's one of the biggest ones. But you're right. I mean, the federal government is broken. If you look at a lot of these junior lawmakers that go to Congress, most of it's about creating a platform for themselves and creating an identity for themselves in sort of the media culture. And you see a different case in state legislatures where it's a more calming narrative, and also just listening to constituents and getting to work and pushing back through some of the centralization that's going on.
You mentioned a couple of areas in which state legislatures are taking a strong move, and that is emergency powers reform and also bolstering election integrity. We've seen both of those here in North Carolina, too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just nationally there's been like hundreds and hundreds of bills in 45 states, and maybe even close to 1,000. A number of them have passed, and you've had situations where even Republican legislatures have taken on governors in their own party. You've had bipartisanship in the state of New York to cut Cuomo's some of his powers. And here in North Carolina, we've had it's been a little bit more partisan here in North Carolina, but we've had efforts to curtail the governor's emergency powers. That's been a big hot button issue here with kind of continued lockdowns from Governor Cooper. So I do think that the good sign is that maybe even though if it wasn't immediate, that state legislators are responding to their constituents, that they have their ears to the ground, that they're more likely to do something in this situation than Congress.
How much of this ties into the enduring principle of American federalism that you identify in the column, and that is the government that governs closest is the one that governs best?
Right. That's an important principle in American history and sort of our founding, obviously. Calvin Coolidge has a great line where he talks about when you think of government, if you think of the national government first, you've kind of lost that argument. You should be thinking about state and local government first. They're closest to the people. They're more likely to respond to needs, to criticisms, to a change in an agenda. So that's just an essential reason that we have federalism, for the separation of power purposes, but also to have a governing class that is closer to the people. And of course, getting back to that 10th Amendment, I think is essential if we're going to ever in this nation, in separating the powers that are not enumerated specifically in the Constitution are reserved to the states. And I think that's an essential part of the framework of this country if we're going to be successful moving forward as a republic.
Another important point that you make near the end of the piece is you write that Americans have learned that even reshuffling the deck in Washington does little to nothing to change the trajectory of our national decline and division. That does seem to be something that we notice, that whatever happens in Washington, and maybe Donald Trump was slightly different because he was so different and so out of the mainstream. But it seems as if whatever you do and send different people to Washington, the same results come out, whereas things can change dramatically depending on who's sent to Raleigh.
That's a great point. I mean, even with Donald Trump, you mentioned Trump, I think that's an important point. Even if you like Trump or hate Trump, whatever your view on him, he was a response, I think, that our federal government's broken. I mean, he was kind of the symbolic nature of that people didn't trust government. They didn't trust the status quo in Washington. And so we see kind of a reshuffling of the deck again, but nothing gets fixed. In fact, from a policy perspective, the crisis gets worse for most Americans. So you're right. I mean, again, state legislatures are responding. And I think one of the important points in this is that they're getting a lot of pressure from corporate media. They're getting a lot of pressure from outside special interest groups, from outside of North Carolina. We saw this in the lieutenant governor's races, but other races where big money comes in, whether it comes from Soros or other individuals, unions. They're trying to take out these lawmakers, but they're resisting a lot of that pressure and still listening to their constituents. And I think that's an important point in all of this, that state legislatures are bound to the people at such a greater degree than what you have in more theoretical or abstract Washington, D.C., where it's become so partisan driven and so bunkered that you don't see kind of the cooperation that you have at state legislatures and the ability to push through an agenda, and hopefully, in many cases, for groups like John Locke, is get real legislation passed that's meaningful.
The headline at CarolinaJournal.com once again: a broken federal government reminds us there's hope in state legislatures. Its author is Ray Nothstine. He is opinion editor at Carolina Journal. Thanks so much.
Thank you.